talk about having pressure. I've got pressure. What time do you all want to go home? Should I? Depends on whether you're good or not.
If you're good, we'll stay long.
Just get up and leave whenever you think you found out which category this thing falls into. What I'd like to do, I hope that this may be partially helpful at least. There are many of you who, when it comes to the details of the starting of churches and the various personalities concerned with churches and religious groups in the Ozarks, know a whole lot more about that than I do, and I'll get myself in trouble even if I try to compete with you on that score. If I have anything to contribute, it might be to try to put religion in the Ozarks, particularly I want to talk about 19th century basically, into the context of what was going on in religion in the United States in those times, because there was we haven't been quite as isolated in some ways as we think we have. Things have tended to happen here because of larger movements that were taking place in the country as a whole. And I might say, by the way, when I say we, I really do mean we. I'm an Ozarker for all of my life, and so I'm not. That's what I mean. We. I was talking before during lunch about growing. And when I was growing up, even though I lived in Springfield, I had relatives, my mother's family in Wright County, and fortunately had some of the experiences connected with the old life and the old ways of doing things, and with the old religious services and so on. But what I want to emphasize right now is the kind of larger context and how that ties to what has happened to us in the Ozarks. You really talk about 1800 to 1860, the period right after the Revolutionary War, when you talk about organized religion in this part of the country, because that's when the people came in, of course, and the organized religion came right along with them. And there are some things that happened, some characteristics of that period in history that are particularly interesting that help to explain some of the things that happened. It was a period, as you know, of a rapid expansion to the west from the east. We were a part of that. Many of the people who have lived here and their families have lived here since the first settlements came, of course, during that period. It was a period when the United States was growing very rapidly in population. It was a period of a great deal of immigration, and I want to say more about that shortly. The first people who came to this country, for the most part, who were connected with the culture we think of today, were English and Irish and Scotch and so on. But during that period between 1800 and 1860, many people came from, especially Northern Europe, Germans, Scandinavians, and so on. It was a period when those people were making their initial homes in this country, and many of them finding their way into the middle part of the country. It was a period also of tremendous optimism. Everybody felt back in those days that heaven on earth was right around the corner. We had unlimited space. If you didn't do too well here, you could just move on over there and do a little better. Tremendous sense of optimism, and along with that, a sense of experimentation that's probably greater than any other time in our history. I hear people who are horrified today because they hear about communes and people dabbling with our traditional forms of marriage and so on, get very upset with this and say, oh, I really wish we were back in the old days where people were firm and solid on these things. I'm sure many of you know that we've never had a period of more experimentation with just sort of weird or different approaches toward culture and institutions than we had back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, along in that time. If time would permit, I'd like to just trace something like marriage. We talk today, we wring our hands a little bit, maybe we ought to, about the sort of loosening up of the traditional forms of marriage. But look at what was happening back in the 1830s and 40s. You had the Mormons with experimentation with polygamy. You had the Oneida colony, communes back in the east where they had group marriage. You had the Amana colonies and peoples up in Iowa where there was a communist, a pure communist kind of culture. I'm not talking about the political system we now call communism, but where everybody owned everything in common. They did maintain the concept of a husband and wife, but the women all took their turn with the cooking, say 1 week or 2 weeks, and then they do the washing the next time and so on. They lived very much in in common. They became very prosperous. I don't know. I don't have time to talk about the Amana College. They're very interesting. People there eventually got so prosperous, that they it was one religious sect which you couldn't get into, no matter how converted you might feel, because you got a share of all of the things that the community owned, and by that time they owned a considerable amount. There were the Shakers, who experimented with the idea of total celibacy of both sexes, and the only way they could perpetuate themselves was take in orphans. So you had every kind of thought you could possibly find about the marriage relationship during that period. It was a period of very strong millennial hope. People believed that literally heaven on earth was just about to arrive. And there was a good bit of writing on that. Alexander Campbell's publication, which swept across the frontier, was called The Millennial Harbinger. The little bird singing that the millennium was about to come, that heaven on earth was about to come. There was William Miller and that whole incredible episode in which he determined what day the world was going to end, the 1840s. And over 1 million people in America at that time firmly and devoutly believed that he was right. And that kind of thinking swept the country. It was the kind of thing that people could go for. The signs seemed to show that we were about to reach a kind of heaven on earth. And so this very strong feeling that things are about to get so good that we're just going to hardly be able to stand it. It's going to be so wonderful in just a very short time. You may be familiar with a book by Alice Felt Tyler. It's called Freedom's Ferment. It's not a new book, but it's one I would really recommend to you, in which all of these things I've been mentioning here are discussed in fuller form. Freedom's Ferment, the period during our national life when we had lots of room, we had lots of personal freedom, the sky was the limit, and we were just thinking up every kind of possible thing we could to experiment. Something that people do not often realize about religion is that just before this period, when you come to just the end of the Revolutionary period, it was the low point for organized religion in all the history of our country, going all the way back to the very beginning. Statistically, church membership in the year 1776 was something like 5% of the population. It runs now up in the 50s and 60%. People who talk about the good old days when everybody was religious should recognize that during the Revolutionary War, organized religion, institutional religion, was at a very low point. By 1800, it hadn't grown any more than 6.9% of the entire population claimed any kind of church membership. The forms of religion that did exist, particularly among the intellectual and the political leaders at the time, were forms of religion that were very intellectual, generally not connected with any churches, like deism, the religious convictions you find in Jefferson and Franklin and so on. The old colonies, the churches there had become Unitarian for the most part, and then there was the kind of outright skepticism of people like Tom Paine and so on. So in all of that atmosphere, organized religion was down when the nation started. Then there came, though, as the century turned over and into the 19th century, what we call the Second Great Awakening. Timothy Dwight became the president of Yale, and he was a preacher. And nobody at Yale liked preachers, just like today. And Yale was considered to be a cesspool of atheism and iniquity and so on. Timothy Dwight came in and began to preach in the chapel services. Apparently the students still had to come to the chapel services. And a huge revival swept the campus of Yale, and all of these students suddenly got religion, and people were amazed. And then a man named Charles Finney came across the east, and he was the sort of Billy Graham of the day, and huge crowds came to hear him, and the whole culture was turned over by a great religious revival. Well, now out on the frontier, and here I get to something that applies directly to us, on the frontier, that same revival started. But it took the particular kind of form that fit with the new situation. It was a raucous, kind of hurly-burly, loud sort of thing that began to occur, and in particular the form by which religion came to the frontier was the camp meeting. Signs of which, vestiges of which, still exist in some of the religious practices, of course, of our area today. The yearly revival meeting, the idea of an encampment, and so on. These have their ties to the old camp meeting. Now, these meetings took place among people who were relatively new settlers to the area because they had just come from back over in Kentucky and Tennessee and so on, and had moved into this area where there was a kind of religious vacuum. The people who really started these camp meetings and that whole approach toward religion were the Presbyterians. The Baptists picked it up, the Methodists picked it up, and it was widely used by those three groups. And I think you find it interesting, and this is the point I want to come back to shortly, that the groups that won the frontier, that won the nation, and have become the predominant groups, religious groups in the United States, were the revivalistic camp meeting type groups that came into these areas where the settlers had come and brought in religion in this form. Of course, the first, this outbreak, this Second Great Awakening, as the camp meeting started, they were first accompanied with a lot of rather strange things, falling, jerking, rolling, barking, laughing, and so on. And you've heard about those kinds of things that happened in the camp meetings. Later, the camp meetings became somewhat more orderly and more organized, and perhaps would have been thought by Easterners to be a little more respectable than the first outbreaks. I ran across, however, a very interesting letter from a man who had seen one of these early camp meetings. It's a letter from in Lexington, Kentucky. It was written in 1801, and I read it even though that's a little out of our area, because it was the overflow from this kind of thing that swept into the Ozarks and brought the first organized religion here. This is a letter to Reverend John King from Colonel Robert Patterson, and I just picked an excerpt of it to give you some of the flavor here. I proceeded the next morning to Concord, where a sermon was preached, at which several became affected and struck down. The exercises continued all night. This was the first occasion that showed the necessity of performing outdoors. The number being so great, the Lord's Supper was administered at a tent. A great solemnity appeared all day. A number were struck down, on the whole occasion about 150. The exercises continued from Saturday till Wednesday, day and night, without intermission. The appearance itself was awful and solemn. It was performed in a thick grove of beech and timber. Candles were furnished by the congregation. The night was still and calm. Add to that exhortations, praying, singing, the cries of the distressed on account of sin, the rejoicing of those that were delivered from their sins' bondage and brought to enjoy the liberty that is in Christ Jesus, all going on at the same time. About 4,000 persons attended. This was the first occasion that showed the necessity of encamping on the ground, the neighborhood not being able to furnish strangers with accommodation, nor had they a wish to separate. As well as I am able, I will describe it. Now he's going to describe what it meant to get affected. You notice he says so many people were affected. Now he says this never did happen to me, but I've talked with people that it did happen to. Not being able to describe it experimentally, he says, I will tell it as I have it from the subjects. Of all ages, from 8 years and upwards, male and female, rich and poor, the blacks of every denomination, those in favor of it, as well as those at the instant in opposition to it and railing against it, have instantaneously laid motionless on the ground. It didn't matter whether you wanted to get it or not. In fact, you could be fighting it, and at the very moment you were objecting to it, you would be instantaneously laid motionless on the ground. Some feel the approaching symptoms by being under deep convictions. Their heart swells, their nerves relax, and in an instant they become motionless and speechless, but generally retain their senses. It comes upon others like an electric shock, as if felt in the great arteries of the arms and thighs. It closes quickly into the heart, which swells like to burst. The body relaxes and falls motionless. The hands and feet become cold, and yet their pulse is as formerly, though sometimes rather slow, and they continue in that state from 1 hour to 24 hours. People, and I find this particularly interesting, people in a number of instances in opposition have felt it coming on and have endeavored to fly but could not get away. They have been struck in the woods in the act of running away. Now, as I say, this particular phenomenon of being struck down is not necessarily characteristic of all of the camp meetings, but out of the excitement involved in that came a great movement which began to sweep then onto the frontier, out to the places where people were somewhat more scattered, where the communities were not quite as old. Also, in addition to that rather emotional kind of camp meeting, the people connected with the Restoration movement, the disciples, Christian churches and churches of Christ and so on, also that is a movement that grew up on the frontier. And while the preachers in that movement objected to the emotionalism and some of these being affected and so on, they nevertheless did accept the idea of the revival, holding the revival, and of reaching people through the means of the revival. And so from having only 2 churches in 1827, by 1836, this particular group was the 4th largest religious group in the United States. Only those other 3 that had been using the revivalist methods had more members. And among those 4, the frontier was pretty well won, and always in pretty much the same way, by means of the revival. Now, we got, as I say, the overflow from that. The big camp meetings didn't take place in our part of the country, but the people who came in preaching, holding the revivals and so on, came almost in a direct line from those very things that were happening over in Kentucky and Tennessee. If you kind of look at the map and check your histories of some of the early churches and who started them and where they came from and so on, you see a movement to a great extent up through southeastern Missouri and then on over into our area as almost the shock waves were coming from the Kentucky and the Tennessee camp meetings. The earliest Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterian preachers tended almost always to come from Kentucky and from Tennessee. The disciples, same thing was true. A lot has been said about the revivals, and I won't say too much more other than to say that some people say they really sort of civilized the frontier. They were a way of bringing some kind of order to what might have been very unruly situation. Otherwise, they did have a way of cutting down on the drinking and the gambling and the fighting, at least for a while, until it would sort of die out. I mean, the height of the convictions about these things, but the next year, when the next period of revival came, that tended to calm everybody down a little bit. Another reason the revivals were very important is because early attempts at education followed often very much on the heels of the revival movements. And the first schools tended to be religious schools. Back in 1844, the Spring River Academy, a high school that might have been the first in southwest Missouri. Over in Springfield, there was Carleton College out there. We still have College Street as one of the major streets in Springfield, named for a school out there operated by the disciples. And particularly after the Civil War, the schools in our area were for the most part religious schools. Many of those schools, of course, have died, but some others survive and have had a tremendous influence on the area. Drury College falls into that category. Missouri Valley at Marshall, Southwest Baptist at Bolivar, Cotty College, and so on in the area, all coming from that impulse that the people had. You sort of got settlement, then you got revivals, and then you got the great emphasis or interest in education, and all of those were rather closely tied together. In Arkansas, the educational movement in some ways is even more important because Arkansas did not develop the state regional universities and colleges and so on as Missouri did, and so the great bulk of collegiate work in Arkansas has been carried through the years by schools that originally got their impulse out of this period. Now that all I have been talking about, the Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Disciple, Scotch-Irish, English part of our culture. There is another whole movement in which we relate religion and the Ozarks and Missouri in general that I want to talk about, and those are the immigrant churches. I mentioned that there was between 1800 and 1860 there was a great influx of people from Europe, and these people were from Germany, basically, most of them from Germany, also from the Scandinavian countries. Tremendous influx. These people religiously were either Roman Catholic or Lutheran, or in some cases evangelical or evangelical and Reformed. They were, as I say, normally Germans or perhaps Scandinavians. Now, the effect that this immigration had on our part of the country is perhaps not as great as in some places, although it has implications even for our life today. Great numbers of people in that way came into, particularly St. Louis and along the Missouri River, and of course some communities even right in the area we're talking about here. But the most of them settled along the river. Now, these were people who came with rather firm religious convictions, rather well organized culturally. They weren't like the people scattered around on the frontier who waited sort of for the revivalists to come and then churches were built and so on. They came with churches intact. They often came with their own pastors, with their own church leaders from the old country. They often had services in the old language. We still have services, even in our immediate area here, held in the German language, for example. There was a sort of closeness, a cultural closeness that tied the people culturally and religiously, and they were sort of outsiders. They were newer here, and they tended to pull together. They quite early developed their own school systems, and so it was almost as though we had two cultures. You had what I might call the old culture, the Scotch, Irish, English, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, culture. Then you had the new one coming in, the Lutheran, Roman Catholic. I hope that doesn't mean we're about to be attacked or anything. Okay. It doesn't mean we're going to burn down, does it? Okay. These two societies lived alongside each other, but they were not, they didn't really mix a great deal. And that's been true up until very recent times. In the Civil War, you could see a difference, differing ideas between the two, in that in general, the people who've been here for a while and who fall into this particular kind of Protestant culture I was talking about, you know, they tended to favor the South. Now, I'm just generalizing here, but they tended to favor the South. Whereas the people who had come in the 1830s and 40s and who were settling mainly in St. Louis and along the river, and then some had gotten down into this area, they tended to favor the North. So there we were living close to each other, but with our own with different school systems, different political systems, and so on, and potentially could have been some real serious problems, and sometimes were. Then after the war, after the Civil War occurred, there was another wave of immigration, and this group of people came from South Europe and Eastern Europe. Great numbers of people from what we today would call Czechoslovakia and Poland, people from Italy and so on. They were almost entirely Roman Catholic. And in 1890, 9 million people came into the United States. And by 1910, it was 16 million people a year. And that radically changed the cultures in which these great numbers of people came. Well, again, Southwest Missouri was relatively untouched by that, although the larger cities along the river again in Missouri were touched, Kansas City and St. Louis and so on. And what I would like, just, there are other things I could say, but in the interest of time in trying to pull this together, I think that probably in the last 10 or 15 years, we find almost for the first time in our history those two cultures beginning to interpenetrate. And we were talking before, or during lunch here, about, I saw a map the other day that indicated that Taney County was the fastest growing, percentage-wise, fastest growing county in the state over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're beginning to have the two cultures that have always in the history of the peoples of the state beginning to interpenetrate, live close to each other. The old parochial school systems beginning to break down a little bit. The revival is not so much the way that religion is spread now. We're in a period, I guess it's not a very profound thing to get up here and say that we live in rapidly changing times. But we live in a very rapidly changing time as regards to religion and the relationship of religion to the Ozarks, in that we now have this kind of mixture that never did occur before. And if, as I say, I could make any contribution at all today, it might be to give us some kind of context to see this, to understand not only where the old frame churches that you run onto around here came from and what their background is, but the potential for the future, as people who've never really spent much time talking to each other, understanding each other, find in this great movement of peoples that they live next door to each other now and have come from very different religious backgrounds with a very different kind of heritage. And perhaps we'll need to spend some time saying, tell me about that. I want to understand that a little better. Thank you very much.
It seemed as if in this particular time that women were the ones that more or less carried the religious load. And this particular great-grandmother of mine had the 12 sons and no daughters, just 12 sons back in, they were born all the way from the early 1840s through the 60s. So they were having the big protracted meeting. And by the way, they were protracted meetings here. Remember, instead of revivals, it was a protracted meeting. So they were having the protracted meeting, and the mourner's bench had been full. And Grandma decided that John should be converted. He was her baby son, and she was quite concerned about it. So the revival was about to break up, and she went back one night to talk to John. She said, "Now, John, son, I'm getting old, and you know I won't be around much longer, and I could die in peace if you just come on up the mourner's bench and be saved. If I could just see you saved tonight, John, I could go home and be satisfied to die." He said, "Now, Ma, there ain't no use at all of me coming up there and going to that mourner's bench tonight, because," he said, "you know, we've got that new ground to break. And you know there ain't nobody in the world can go out there and break that new ground with all the stumps and the roots it's got in it. And they can't do that without cussing, Ma. So there ain't no use for me to go out there tonight and be saved, because I just backslide now, because I'll have to cuss. And she said, oh, Johnny boy, if you'll just come on up tonight and be saved, John, she said, I'll see that your pa plows that new grass, and he's going to go to hell anyway. Really delighted that all of you came. Our next meeting will be the June meeting. It is the annual meeting. We'll let you know exactly the date. It is the election of officers. Thank you for coming. We'll see you all in June.